In the heart of the city, St. Mary's Hospital stood as a beacon of hope, or so it seemed. Behind its pristine walls and well-lit corridors lay a chilling secret, whispered only in hushed tones among the staff who worked the graveyard shift. Room 217, at the end of a seldom-used hallway, was the epicenter of a dark legend that had persisted for decades. Ellie Harper, a seasoned nurse known for her dedication, had always dismissed the stories. Ghosts, she thought, were the fabrications of overworked minds and idle gossip. But that belief was tested when she was assigned to the night shift and found herself stationed near the infamous room. When she opened the door, the room was bathed in an eerie blue light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. The air was thick and cold, and the faint scent of antiseptic mingled with something metallic and cloying. At the center of the room stood a figure, a woman in a tattered hospital gown, her back turned to Ellie. Her hair was matted, and her head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Ma'am?" Ellie managed, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but instead began to turn, her movements jerky and disjointed. When Ellie finally saw her face, she staggered back. A scream lodged in her throat. The woman's eyes were hollow sockets, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her features twisted in anguish. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, and the door slammed shut behind Ellie. She spun around, tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The sobbing grew louder, now mingled with whispers that seemed to come from every corner of the room. Words in a language Ellie didn't understand echoed in her ears, and the figure began to move closer, her feet dragging across the floor with a sickening scrape. Desperate, Ellie closed her eyes and began to pray, clutching the locket around her neck, a keepsake from her late brother. The whispers crescendoed, and just as Ellie thought she would be consumed by the darkness, everything stopped. The room fell silent, the oppressive cold lifted, and when Ellie opened her eyes, the figure was gone. Ellie stumbled out of room 217, her legs shaking. She reported the incident to her supervisor, but her account was met with skepticism. The next morning, however, she discovered an old photograph tucked into her locker. It showed a group of nurses from the 1950s standing in front of St. Mary's Hospital. Among them, scribbled on the back, were the words, "Help her." Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly woman's torment was far from over. Driven by a mix of fear and compassion, she began researching the hospital's history, uncovering a series of chilling events tied to room 217. The deeper she delved, the more she realized that some doors should never be opened. But it was too late to turn back now. Ellie was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing the horrors that awaited her in the shadows of St. Mary's Hospital. The first few nights were uneventful, though Ellie couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light, and the hum of the fluorescent bulbs above occasionally faltered, plunging the hallway into brief moments of darkness. Her unease grew, but she remained resolute, unwilling to let fear get the better of her. It was on the fifth night that things took a sinister turn. Ellie was making her rounds when she heard a faint sound coming from room 217, a soft, mournful sobbing. She froze, her pulse quickening. The room had been unoccupied for years, sealed off after a series of unexplained deaths. Gathering her courage, Ellie approached the door, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silent corridor. She placed her hand on the doorknob, hesitating as a chill seeped through her fingers. It had always been the perfect place to escape the weight of reality. A hidden gem tucked between two darkened alleyways in the city. The last drop was the kind of bar you'd stumble upon after a long day or on a dreary night when the world seemed to have lost its color. The neon sign out front buzzed weakly, casting a faint red glow onto the rain-slicked streets. Inside, the low hum of conversations blended with the steady rhythm of the jukebox, which seemed to always play a mix of old rock ballads and jazz standards. There was something comforting in its disjointed charm. That was until the night it all changed. On the evening of October 12th, the air felt thick with an unnatural heaviness as soon as Adam stepped through the door. He had been coming to the last drop for years, It was his place to unwind after the grind of his office job. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and his skin appeared sickly pale under the dim lights. He wore a long, dark coat, though it wasn't particularly cold. The man never seemed to interact with anyone, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, just staring. Adam's curiosity piqued and he leaned in closer to Sarah. "Who's that guy? I haven't seen him here before." Sarah hesitated, looking toward the back corner before answering in a low voice. "I don't know. He showed up a few nights ago. He doesn't talk to anyone, just sits there, staring, but no one's been brave enough to ask him about it." "Creepy," Adam muttered, turning his gaze back to the mysterious figure. For the rest of the night, the club seemed to grow quieter, the air growing colder, though the heating system was working fine. Adam tried to shake off the sense of unease that hung over him, but couldn't. It was as if the very walls of the bar had grown tired, weighed down by some hidden, unspoken truth. Adam's heart began to race. He turned to look towards the back corner where the mysterious man had been sitting. His seat was empty. And then, as if on cue, the back door to the hallway creaked open. It wasn't a gust of wind or a shift in the building that made it open. It was deliberate, as if something was beckoning the darkness inside. The footsteps grew louder. They weren't the steps of any of the patrons, or Sarah, and certainly not of anyone Adam recognized. They were too heavy, too deliberate. Without thinking, Adam stood up and made his way to the door that led to the back hallway. As he approached, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the hairs on his neck stood on end. He reached for the doorknob, his fingers trembling as he gripped it. The moment he twisted the knob, the door flew open with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet. He staggered forward, eyes squinting as a sudden onslaught of cold air. But it wasn't the chill of a winter breeze. It was something darker, something that didn't belong. The familiar faces of regulars lined the bar, their voices low, their laughter muted, as if they too had sensed the shift in the atmosphere. The bartender, Sarah, flashed him a tired smile as she poured him his usual whiskey, her eyes darting to the back of the room where the shadows seemed to creep unnaturally along the walls. "Something weird in the air tonight, huh?" Adam said, as he took a sip of the amber liquid. Sarah didn't respond right away. Her fingers were tense as she wiped down the counter, avoiding his gaze. The tension was palpable, and for a brief moment, Adam wondered if it was just his imagination. But something in the air didn't sit right. The usual hum of chatter seemed muffled, like the room was holding its breath. As he turned his attention to the group of people sitting at a nearby table, he noticed one figure that stood out. A man, his features sharp and angular, sat alone at the back corner of the bar. Later that evening, as the clock neared closing time, the power in the bar suddenly flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of people shifting nervously in their seats. Then, as if on cue, the low hum of the jukebox sputtered back to life, but this time, it played something unfamiliar, something eerie. The sound of static filled the room, followed by a distorted voice that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The voice was distorted, almost like a whisper, though no one could make out the words. A collective shiver ran down everyone's spine. "Sarah, is everything all right?" Adam called out. There was no answer. He could hear footsteps, but they didn't sound like Sarah's usual quick steps. These were slow, deliberate. The sound of the footsteps echoed in the silence, growing louder with each passing second. "Hello?" Adam's voice cracked as it left his lips. The figure turned slowly, its face emerging from the shadows. Adam froze in place. The face was pale, almost translucent, with eyes that were impossibly wide. The man's features were sunken, his mouth drawn tight, lips nearly disappearing into the hollow of his face. His eyes were empty, like two dark pools that reflected nothing. "Get out," the man whispered, his voice barely audible, as though it was coming from far away. Adam staggered back, his heart racing. He didn't know whether to run or to confront whatever this was. But before he could move, the figure reached out toward him, its hand unnaturally long, fingers skeletal and cold as ice. The grip was vice-like, and though Adam tried to pull away, the hand tightened, dragging him forward into the darkness of the hallway. The hallway beyond the door was long and narrow, illuminated only by a single flickering light at the far end. It was a place no one dared to enter, where the old storage rooms and forgotten pieces of furniture were stashed away. The place where the walls were cracked and the floorboards creaked underfoot. From the corner of his eye, Adam caught movement. Just a flash, but enough to send his pulse racing. Someone was there, standing at the end of the hallway. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its back to him, as if waiting for him to approach. Something compelled Adam to step forward. He couldn't say why. He felt as though his body was moving without his consent. His footsteps echoed loudly in the silence as he moved closer to the figure. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to thicken, as though the very space around him was becoming heavier. The figure remained still, its form now almost absorbed by the darkness, save for the faint outline of a long coat.